Well, it all started about 3 summers ago. I was spending a summer at my friend's house, and they had 100 classic books on the bookshelf. And so I thought, well, I'm going to spend the summer reading these 100 classics. And I ended up grabbing Treasure Island as one of them. And I read it and I was just fascinated. I remembered reading it as a kid, but it didn't really dawn on me how rich the characters were and the story was so well told. And at the end of reading it, I was just sort of sad that it was over. And I thought, why didn't Stevenson write a sequel to it? And I reread the ending again and realized that he had set it up to where it couldn't be a sequel. I thought about it, and then one day woke up with an idea of, well, here's a way that a sequel could be done. And so I spent the next 6 months, 9 months working out a story idea. And I realized that there were a couple elements that I really wished were in the first book that Stevenson had actually promised to do when he wrote the original book, but didn't happen, one of them being a romance. In fact, but for Jim's mother in the original book, there was no women. And I also realized that I needed to introduce a couple of new characters so it wasn't just a rehash of the old story. It was with great trepidation, actually, that I even thought about doing it because it was so well written. And he was such a great writer that I had to think long and hard about, am I going to do it, am I not going to do it, because a bad version would be worse than not doing it at all. And one of my biggest inspirations for it was I was such a fan of the original book, I wanted to be a fan of the sequel. So that was what caused me to go on the adventure of writing, actually, Return to Treasure Island. One of the first obstacles I had to overcome, of course, was that the book was written in the late 1800s, and there was a completely different cadence, a different way of languaging books back then. Certainly Mark Twain and other authors at the time used the same language, but it's a little more difficult language for modern-day readers to get through. In fact, the original Treasure Island was a bit of a hard read for me. Realizing that, I also didn't want to make it completely modern like today's writing, so I decided to sort of split the difference of the 1800 cadence and the modern day languaging, and that was the first decision I made. The second decision I made was I wanted to be absolutely true to the pirate cadence or talk. So I went about and went through the book and cataloged how pirates spoke, according to Robert Louis Stevenson. Once I had that finished, and I had realized what I was going to do as far as the languaging, then it became clear how the book was going to sound. And so that started me on my journey to writing it. Well, the story itself and the writing itself evolved. I knew that I needed to get Jim Hawkins back to Treasure Island, so I had to create a reason for him to come back, and I'm not going to say exactly what that reason is because it's part of the book. But once I realized that there was a reason for him to get back, then I had to create new characters in addition to the characters that we already knew of, like Long John Silver and the squire and the doctor and the inn with his mother. And then I also created another world that hadn't been addressed before, called Pirates Cove. I made a decision right at the beginning that I was going to retain as many of the original characters as I could from Treasure Island. For one thing, they're very familiar. And so anybody familiar with Treasure Island, I didn't have to go into a lot of backstory. But for more importantly, again, I was a fan of Treasure Island. I didn't want to change it as far as the characters go. But the next thing I had to decide was, I had read some old articles about the original Treasure Island. They talked about, at least Stevenson talked about, it was a romantic adventure. However, surprisingly, there's no women in it. So I decided to add a romantic element to Jim Hawkins, which would make it more interesting because the first book was a coming of age from a boy to a man. This Return to Treasure Island, although it has elements of that, is also the coming of age into partnership and love. When I read Treasure Island, I was just really taken in by how deeply and richly it was written. The characters were well defined, the story was very, very creative. And I realized that even though most people say Treasure Island is a young adult book, it was certainly entertaining for me. So at the end of the book, I was sad that it ended, and I thought, why didn't Stevenson ever write another book? And the reason was he ended the book by Jim promising never to return to that accursed island again. In thinking about it, I really wanted to create an additional story in the voice of Jim Hawkins, who was the original voice of the book. And so that was the beginning of the formulation of writing Return to Treasure Island. My hope for Return to Treasure Island is to bring the reader back into the joy and adventure of the original Treasure Island. It was a great story, the original, where Jim Hawkins went from boy to becoming a man. And he learned about human emotions, and he learned about human beings. And he really had to make moral decisions about what he was going to do and not going to do. In Return to Treasure Island, I've brought him back into those same moral dilemmas. He has a huge choice that he has to make. And I wanted the reader to have the fun of going through a treasure hunt and the mystery of a treasure hunt. And so I've actually added a lot deeper elements to the treasure hunt. But most of all, at the end of it, my hope is that the reader says, wow, that was a great story. It made me want to go and learn more about Treasure Island. And as an aside, without exception, everyone who's read it, that's talked to me about it, the first thing that comes out of their mouths is, I really want to read the original Treasure Island again, because it brings you to want to know, what was the original story? And that to me is a very, very fulfilling moment and a very happy thing to hear from the readers. My goal for the book is to entertain the reader. Although the original book was considered a young adult book, it really was sort of a difficult read. And I remember reading it as a child, and I loved the pirate story, but I didn't realize the depth of the characters and the real way it was written to be very philosophical as far as character development. So, although I would like it to be a young adult book, I think adults would like it too. In fact, more adults seem to like it than children. And my goal is to entertain, and at the end of the day, when they're done reading the book, I would like them to say, boy, this was a great adventure. I'd really like to read the original Treasure Island. And that to me is exciting, because I loved the original Treasure Island. Such a fan. And if this book can drive people to the original Stevenson book, I feel I've done a great job.